The cleaning crew wasn't supposed to find anything unusual in Harold Richardson's garage, but when they pried open that rusted metal trunk hidden beneath decades of accumulated newspapers and Christmas decorations, they discovered something that would shatter the peaceful facade of Millfield, Connecticut forever. What they found inside that trunk would finally answer questions that 6 families had been asking for 30 years, questions about children who had simply vanished without a trace. From this quiet New England town where everyone knew everyone and doors were left unlocked, after dark. But before we reveal what was hidden in that trunk, you need to understand just how deeply Harold Richardson had embedded himself into the fabric of this community and how his carefully constructed persona had allowed him to operate undetected for over 3 decades. Because what the investigators would discover wasn't just evidence of isolated crimes, but proof of a systematic predator who had turned an entire town's trust into his hunting ground. Harold Richardson had been Millfield's most beloved resident for over 5 decades. The 84-year-old retired mathematics teacher lived alone in the white colonial house at 47 Maple Street, the same house where he'd raised his own family before tragedy struck in ways that would make his later crimes seem like a twisted form of cosmic justice. His wife Margaret had died of cancer in 1978 after a brutal 2-year battle that had drained their savings and left Harold emotionally devastated. Their only son David had been killed in a car accident just 5 years later, leaving Harold alone with his grief and the kind of emptiness that can either destroy a person or transform them into something unrecognizable to the outside world. Harold had chosen healing over bitterness. He'd thrown himself into community service, volunteering at the local elementary school where he'd taught for 32 years before retirement, tutoring struggling students in his living room every Tuesday and Thursday evening and maintaining the flower beds around the town common with the dedication of someone who truly cared about his neighbors. His gentle demeanor and infinite patience with children had made him a fixture at school events, church socials and town meetings, where his soft-spoken wisdom was sought by parents and administrators alike. Harold's reputation in Millfield was sterling. He was the man who shoveled elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked, who remembered every child's birthday in his vicinity, and who could be counted on to volunteer for any community project that needed reliable help. The Millfield Gazette had featured him in their annual Hometown Heroes edition 3 times, highlighting his volunteer work at the food bank, his leadership in organizing the town's annual Christmas pageant, and his dedication to tutoring children who were struggling with mathematics concepts that their regular teacher couldn't explain effectively. But what nobody in Millfield, Connecticut knew was that this frail-looking 84-year-old man was harboring secrets that would have horrified the community that had embraced him as their unofficial grandfather figure. The basement of his colonial house contained a workshop where he'd spent countless hours over the past 4 decades, not building birdhouses or refinishing furniture as his neighbors assumed, but creating something far more sinister, a space that existed solely to serve his darkest impulses. A place where 6 children had spent their final terrifying hours. Between 1982 and 2009, the basement workshop was accessed through a door behind Harold's furnace that most visitors to his house would never have noticed. The door was painted the same color as the basement walls and was hidden behind stacks of old textbooks and teaching materials that created an impression of storage rather than concealment. Behind that door lay a soundproofed room approximately 12 feet by 8 feet with concrete walls that Harold had reinforced over the years, and a ceiling that had been treated with acoustic tiles to prevent sound from traveling to the floor. The brew room contained restraints that had been professionally installed and regularly maintained, cleaning supplies that went far beyond what any normal household would require, and photographic equipment that Harold had used to document his crimes in meticulous detail. The workshop's floor was constructed with a drainage system that allowed Harold to clean up after his activities without leaving traces that might be discovered by unexpected visitors. The entire space represented years of planning and preparation by someone who understood exactly what he intended to do there. Harold also constructed an elaborate system for disposing of evidence that demonstrated his understanding of forensic investigation techniques. He had installed an industrial-grade incinerator in a shed behind his house that he used to destroy clothing and other materials that might contain DNA evidence, had created multiple burial sites on his property and in remote locations around Millfield, where he could dispose of remains without fear of discovery, and he had developed relationships with local contractors and landscaping companies that gave him access to equipment and materials needed for excavation and concrete work. The discovery that would expose Harold's double life began with something as mundane as estate planning. Harold had suffered a minor stroke in February 2023, and though he recovered quickly, the incident had prompted his nephew Robert to insist on getting Harold's affair in order. Robert lived in Boston and had maintained only sporadic contact with his uncle over the years, but Harold was his only surviving relative, and Robert felt obligated to ensure the old man's wishes were properly documented. What Robert didn't know was that Harold had been preparing for this moment for months, carefully destroying evidence and disposing of items that might raise questions about his activities over the past 30 years. Harold's preparation for his eventual death had been as methodical as everything else he had done throughout his criminal career. He had spent the final months of his life systematically destroying photographs and documents that might implicate him in his crimes, while preserving certain items that he apparently wanted to be discovered after his death. Psychologists would later theorize that Harold's preservation of the trunk and its content represented a desire for recognition of his crimes, even if that recognition would come only after he was beyond the reach of earthly justice. Harold Richardson died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, found by his neighbor Mrs. Dorothy Chen, when he failed to appear for the daily 9 a.m. coffee ritual on his front porch. Mrs. Chen had been sharing morning coffee with the elderly man for over 15 years, and his absence immediately worried her enough to use the spare key he'd given her for emergencies. When she found the 84-year-old Harold in his bed looking serene and undisturbed, she called 911 and then Robert to inform him that his uncle had passed away in what appeared to be a natural death for a man approaching his 85th birthday. Robert Richardson arrived from Boston that afternoon to begin the overwhelming task of settling his uncle's estate. House was immaculate as always. Harold had been obsessively neat throughout his life, keeping every room organized with the precision that had made him such an effective teacher. But the sheer volume of possessions accumulated over 7 decades of life would require professional help. Robert contacted Millfield Cleaning Services, a local company that specialized in estate cleanouts, and arranged for them to begin work the following Monday, while he handled the legal and financial aspects of Harold's death. Robert's initial walkthrough of his uncle's house revealed the life of a man who maintained the appearance of normalcy even in his final years. Harold's bedroom contained photographs of his deceased wife and son, along with mementos from his teaching career and evidence of the community activities that had occupied his retirement. His kitchen was well organized with cooked supplies that suggested someone who had learned to prepare meals for one, but who maintained the habits of someone who might need to entertain guests at any moment.
The living room, where Harold had tutored children for decades, showed signs of its educational purpose, with whiteboards mounted on the walls, mathematical reference books arranged on shelves within easy reach, and comfortable seating arranged to facilitate conversation between a teacher and struggle students. Robert found it touching that his uncle had continued helping children even after retirement, and made mental notes about donating Harold's educational materials to the local school district. Harold's study contained his personal library along with financial records that revealed a man who had lived modestly but comfortably on his teacher's pension and Social Security benefits. There were no signs of the kind of financial irregularities that might have suggested illegal activities, and Robert felt reassured that settling the estate would be a straightforward process that would involve complicated legal or financial issues. The cleaning crew that arrived at 47 Maple Street consisted of 3 experienced workers, who had seen everything from hoarding situations to crime scenes during their years in the business. Tom Bradley, the crew chief, had been cleaning out houses for over 20 years, and prided himself on approaching each job with respect for the deceased and their family's grief. His assistants, Maria Santos and Jake Williams, were newer to the work, but had quickly learned that every house told a story through the possessions left behind, and that their job was to preserve dignity while efficiently clearing space for whatever came next. Tom Bradley had developed a systematic approach to estate cleanouts that began with a careful walkthrough to identify items of obvious value or sentimental importance that should be set aside for family members. He learned through experience that grieving relatives often overlooked valuable items in their emotional state, and that professional cleaning crews could serve an important function by ensuring nothing important was accidentally discarded or donated without proper consideration. The crew's initial assessment of Harold's house suggested a straightforward job. The main living areas were clean and well organized, with furniture and belongings that appeared to be in good condition. Harold's possessions seemed to reflect the life of someone who had been careful with his money and had maintained his belongings with the kind of attention to detail that extended his retirement income by avoiding unnecessary replacements of household items. The main house presented no unusual challenges. Harold's belongings were organized and clearly valuable enough to warrant careful sorting for potential donation or sale. His library contained hundreds of mathematics textbooks and classic literature that would be valuable to local schools or libraries. His closets held well-maintained clothing that suggested a man who took pride in his appearance and understood the importance of maintaining a professional image, even in retirement. His kitchen cabinets revealed the eating habits of someone who'd learned to cook for one, but had never lost the instinct to maintain a well-stocked pantry for unexpected guests. Harold's bedroom contained the kind of personal items that made estate cleanup emotionally challenging for professional crews. Photographs of his deceased wife at various stages of their marriage, wedding rings and anniversary gifts that he had apparently been unable to discard after her death, and mementos from his son's childhood including report cards, baseball trophies, artwork that proud parents typically preserve long after their children have grown up and moved away. The crew worked carefully through these items, understanding that they represented the emotional core of Harold's life and deserved to be handled with particular respect. The crew worked methodic through each room, creating separate piles for items that Robert might want to keep, legal documents that required attention, and household goods suitable for donation. Tom Bradley had learned to be particularly careful with personal papers, having discovered everything from valuable stock certificate to important family documents hidden in seemingly mundane locations throughout his career. The garage, however, told a different story than the house. Its concrete floor was stained with what appeared to be decades of oil leaks from Harold's 1998 Honda Civic, and the walls were lined with metal shelving units filled with the kind of accumulated miscellany that every homeowner collects over time. Gardening tools, Christmas decorations, boxes of old tax returns, and teaching materials that Harold had apparently been unable to discard when he retired from his position at Millfield Elementary School 30 years earlier. The garage represented the kind of space where most homeowners stored items they couldn't quite bring themselves to throw away, but didn't have room for in their living spaces. Harold's garage contained the expected accumulation of seasonal decorations, lawn care equipment, and boxes of documents that were probably outdated but might someday be needed for tax or legal purposes. The crew expected this space to contain the bulk of items requiring disposal and had brought their truck around to the garage door for easy loading. Tom Bradley noticed the trunk immediately. When they began clearing the shelves along the garage's back wall, it was wedged between a stack of cardboard boxes containing what appeared to be old textbooks and a collection of clay flower pots that hadn't been used in years. The trunk itself was unremarkable. A standard military-style footlock made of dark green metal with brass corners, and a heavy-duty lock that had been painted over so many times that the original color was impossible to determine. What made Tom pause was the trunk's placement. It wasn't sitting casually among other storage items but had been deliberately positioned, concealed behind objects that would discourage casual examination. The trunk's positioning suggested that Harold had wanted it to remain hidden during his lifetime but had also arranged for it to be discoverable by anyone who conducted a thorough cleaning of his garage. The placement was deliberate to be accidental, but not so hidden that it would remain concealed indefinitely. Tom had encountered similar situations before, where deceased homeowners had left items that they wanted discovered after their death, but hadn't been able to reveal during their lifetime. Maria Santos knows something else about the trunk that made her uncomfortable while Tom and Jake were debating how to move it without damaging Harold's car. She pointed out that the concrete floor beneath the trunk showed clear signs of having been disturbed and reported at some point the surrounding floor was smooth and uniform. But the area directly under the trunk was slightly raised, and showed evidence of patching that didn't match the rest of the garage's foundation. The discovery made the crew wonder what Harold had been storing that required such permanent concealment. The concrete work appeared to have been done by someone with professional skills, rather than a typical homeowner attempting a repair project. The patches were well executed and had been finished to blend with the surrounding floor. But close examination revealed that multiple areas had been excavated and repaired over a period of years. Maria's experience with home renovations made her recognize that this kind of concrete work was expensive and time-consuming, suggesting that whatever Harold had buried beneath his garage floor had been important enough to justify significant effort and expense. The trunk's lock had rusted solid over the years, resisting their initial attempts to open it with the standard tools they carried. Tom sent Jake to borrow a crowbar from Harold's workbench while he and Maria examined the trunk more closely for any indication of what it might contain. The metal showed no manufacturer's marking or military unit insignia that might have suggested it was a memento from Harold's service during the Vietnam War era. Instead, it appeared to have been deliberately stripped of any identifying characteristics and painted multiple times to ensure its contents remained private.
Harold's workbench was located along the garage's south wall and contained the kind of tools and equipment that suggested someone who was capable of handling complex home improvement projects. The workbench was organized with the same precision that Harold had applied to every other aspect of his life, with tools arranged according to type and size, and supplies stored in labeled containers. The quality of the tools suggested someone who understood the importance of having reliable equipment and who had invested in professional-grade items that would last for decades. When Jake returned with a crowbar, Tom wedged it beneath the trunk's hasp and applied steady pressure until the rusted lock mechanism finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet garage. The lid opened smoothly on hinges that had been recently oiled. Despite the lock's deteriorated condition, revealing interior that was lined with plastic sheeting and filled with items that made no sense in the context of a retired teacher's storage needs. The trunk's interior was organized with the same methodical precision that Harold had applied to every other aspect of his life. But the contents were unlike anything the cleaning crew had encountered in years of estate work. The plastic sheeting that lined the trunk was heavy-duty construction material designed to prevent moisture and odors from escaping, and the items inside were arranged in layers that suggested they had been placed there over many years, with each addition carefully positioned to maximize the available space. The first thing Tom saw was a collection of children's clothing carefully folded and arranged as if in a store display. A small pink sweater that appeared to belong to a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old. A pair of blue jeans sized for a boy in elementary school, and several items of underwear that made Tom's stomach lurch as he began to understand what they'd discovered. The clothing appeared to have been preserved with the kind of care typically reserved for precious mementos, but the implications of what Harold would have collected children's clothing made the cleaning crew increasingly uncomfortable. Beneath the clothing were photograph albums filled with images that would haunt the cleaning crew for the rest of their lives. Pictures of children in various states of undress posed in ways clearly indicated they had been taken against the subject's will. The photographs were organized chronologically and showed the same attention to detail that Harold had applied to his teaching materials, with dates and locations carefully noted in his precise handwriting. The albums contained hundreds of images spanning decades, suggesting a level of activity that far exceeded what anyone in Millfield could have imagined. But the photographs were not the most disturbing contents of Harold's trunk. Maria gasped when Tom lifted out a shoebox that rattled with the sound of small objects inside. He opened it. They found themselves looking at a collection of jewelry, hair ribbons, and small personal items that appeared to have been taken from multiple children over many years. Each item was wrapped in tissue paper and labeled with a date written in Harold's precise handwriting. The earliest day was September 15, 1992. And the most recent was November 3, 2019, spanning 27 years of what could only be described as trophies from victims. The items in the shoebox represented a catalog of childhood innocence. Destroyed each piece of jewelry, each hair accessory, each small toy had once belonged to a child who had trusted Harold Richardson with their safety. The careful preservation and labeling of these items suggested that Harold had revisited them regularly. Perhaps as a way of reliving the crimes they represented. The methodical organization was characteristic of Harold's personality, but applied to purposes that transformed his attention to detail from an admirable trait into something deeply disturbing. Jake Williams had seen enough. He stepped outside the garage and called 911 while Tom and Maria stood frozen beside the open trunk, neither wanting to examine its contents further but unable to look away from evidence of crimes that had apparently been occurring in their quiet town for decades. Within minutes they could hear sirens approaching from the direction of the town center, and Tom realized that their discovery was about to transform Millfield, Connecticut, from a peaceful community where nothing ever happened into the center of a criminal investigation that would attract national attention. The 911 dispatcher who took Jake's call had difficulty understanding the nature of what he was reporting. The concept that a respected retired teacher had left behind evidence of crimes against children was so far outside the normal range of emergency calls in Millfield that the dispatcher initially thought Jake might be reporting the discovery of historical artifacts or documents rather than evidence of recent criminal activity. It wasn't until Jake specifically mentioned photographs and children's clothing that the dispatcher understood the seriousness of what the cleaning crew had discovered. Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Connecticut State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived at 47 Maple Street, 45 minutes after Jake's accompanied by a forensics team, and the kind of specialized equipment needed to properly document what appeared to be evidence from multiple serious crimes. Detective Rodriguez had investigated child predators before, but the scope of what the cleaning crew had discovered suggested they were dealing with something far beyond the typical case of inappropriate images or online solicitation. Harold Richardson's trunk contained evidence of crimes that had been committed over nearly 4 decades, with a level of organization and premeditation that indicated extensive planning and a complete lack of remorse. Detective Rodriguez's first priority was securing the crime scene and ensuring that no evidence was contaminated or destroyed by well-meaning individuals who might want to examine the trunk's contents. The garage was immediately sealed with police tape and a security perimeter was established to prevent unauthorized access. The trunk and its contents would need to be photographed and documented before anything could be moved or examined more closely. The initial inventory of the trunk's contents would take forensic specialists over 6 hours to complete, working under tense lighting that had been set up in Harold's garage. Each item was photographed, measured, and cataloged before being carefully removed and preserved as evidence. The clothing items alone represented at least 12 different children, ranging in age from what appeared to be 6 years old to earliest adolescence. But it was the personal effects in the shoebox that would provide the crucial links to specific missing persons cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Detective Rodriguez recognized several of the items immediately from missing person reports she'd studied during her career with the state police. A distinctive charm bracelet that had belonged to Sarah Mitchell, who'd disappeared while walking home from school in September 1992. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses that had belonged to Timothy Chen, who'd vanished from a playground in October 1995, and a small silver cross necklace that had been described in the missing person report filed for Maria Santos, who'd disappeared after her piano lesson in March.
The recognition of these specific items transformed what had initially appeared to be evidence of Harold's disturbed psychological state into proof that he had been responsible for the disappearances of children whose cases had remained unsolved for decades. The implications were staggering. Not only had Harold been collecting inappropriate images and personal items belonging to children, but he had apparently been murdering the children themselves and keeping trophies to commemorate his crimes. But the most chilling discovery came when forensic specialists examined the garage itself more closely, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs borrowed from the FBI's evidence response team. The disturbed concrete that Maria Santos had noticed beneath the trunk's original position showed clear evidence of having been excavated and repoured multiple times over the past 30 years. Radar images revealed voids beneath the floor that were consistent with the size and shape of small bodies, and the cadaver dogs immediately alerted to the presence of human remains beneath the concrete surface. When investigators finally broke through the concrete, they found themselves looking at a carefully constructed burial chamber that contained the skeletal remains of 6 children, arranged with the same obsessive organization that Harold had applied to everything else in his life. The remains were positioned in individual graves that had been lined with plastic sheeting and filled with lime to accelerate decomposition. Each grave was marked with a small metal tag that contained a date and initials that corresponded to the labels on the items in Harold's trophy collection. The discovery of the burial chamber confirmed that Harold Richardson had not only been a collector of inappropriate images and memorabilia, but an active serial killer who had been preying on children in Millfield for nearly 3 decades. The sophistication of his burial system and the care he had taken to preserve certain items while destroying others suggested a level of planning and psychological compartmentalization that had enabled him to commit these crimes while maintaining his reputation as a beloved community figure. Sarah Mitchell had been 8 years old when she'd disappeared on September 15, 1982, while walking the 4 blocks from Millfield Elementary to her family's house on Oak Street. Her mother, Patricia, had called police when Sarah failed to arrive home by 4 p.m., and the subsequent search had involved over 200 volunteers combing through the woods and abandoned buildings around town. Sarah's pink sweater, the same one found in Harold's trunk, had been her favorite piece of clothing, and she'd been wearing it on the day she disappeared, along with the charm bracelet her grandmother had given her for her 8th birthday just 2 weeks earlier. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance had consumed the Millfield Police Department's limited resources for months. Detective Robert Walsh,
who had been assigned to lead the investigation, had followed every possible lead, interviewing dozens of potential witnesses and organizing search parties that covered hundreds of acres of woodland surrounding the town. But despite the extensive effort, no trace of Sarah had ever been found. And the case had eventually been classified as a cold case. When newer emergencies demanded the department's attention, Patricia Mitchell, Sarah's mother, had never given up hope that her daughter would return home someday. She had maintained Sarah's bedroom exactly as it had been, September 15, 1992, keeping her stuffed animals arranged on the bed and her school books stacked on the desk where Sarah had left them while working on homework. The night before she disappeared, Patricia had organized annual vigils on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance and had pressured law enforcement to keep the case active even when it became clear that leads were no longer materializing. The Mitchell family had been particularly devastated by Sarah's disappearance because she had been their only child and the center of their world. Patricia had been a stay-at-home mother, devoted herself completely to raising Sarah while her husband worked as an accountant at a firm in Hartford. The loss of their daughter had destroyed their marriage within 2 years as they struggled with guilt over their failure to protect her and grief over the loss of the future they had planned as a family. Timothy Chen had been 10 years old when he'd vanished from Millfield Community Park on October 12, 1995. He'd been playing alone on the swings while his mother Sandra attended her book club meeting in the park's community center. When Sandra emerged from her meeting at 3, was nowhere to be found despite an extensive search that lasted until well past dark. His wire-rimmed glasses had been a recent addition, prescribed after a school vision screening revealed severe nearsightedness, and he'd been excited about how they made him look more grown up. The search for Tim had been even more intensive than the effort to find Sarah Mitchell, because his disappearance had occurred during daylight hours in a public location, where dozens of people were present. The park's community center had been hosting multiple activities that afternoon, including Sandra's book club, senior citizens exercise class, and a children's art program, which meant that over 50 adults had been on the premises when Timothy disappeared. Yet no one had witnessed anything unusual or suspicious. Sandra Chen had been devastated by her son's disappearance and the lack of answers from law enforcement. She had hired private investigators and consulted with psychics in desperate attempts to find information about Timothy's fate. Her marriage had deteriorated under the stress of his disappearance, and she had eventually divorced her husband Robert and moved to California, where she'd tried to rebuild her life, while never giving up hope that Timothy might somehow be found alive. The Chen family had moved to Millfield just 2 years before Timothy's disappearance, when Robert had taken a job as an engineer with a manufacturing company located outside Hartford. Sandra had been reluctant to move away from the urban environment where she had grown up. But Timothy had seemed to thrive in the small-town atmosphere, making friends easily and enjoying the outdoor activities that were more accessible in rural Connecticut. Maria Santos had been 9 years old when she disappeared on March 18, 1998. After her piano lesson at the home of Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who lived 6 blocks from Maria's family, her parents Juan and Carmen had become worried when Maria failed to return home by 5 p.m. as she always did after her weekly lesson. The silver cross necklace found in Harold's collection had been blessed by the family priest when Maria received her first communion, and she'd never taken it off, according to her mother, who'd provided detailed descriptions to police when filing the missing person report. The investigation into Maria's disappearance had been complicated by the fact that she had vanished during her walk home from piano lessons, a route that took her through a residential neighborhood where she should have been safe. The Santos family had walked the route dozens of times, looking for any clue about what might have happened to their daughter, and neighbors had organized search parties that covered every yard and garage in the surrounding blocks. But no trace of Maria had ever been discovered.
Carmen Santos had been particularly devastated by Maria's disappearance, because she had been the one to encourage her daughter's interest in piano lessons. She had saved money from her job as a seamstress to pay for the weekly lessons, and had been proud of Maria's progress and enthusiasm, learning to play classical pieces. Carmen had blamed herself for allowing Maria to walk alone to and from the lessons, and had struggled with depression and anxiety that had affected her ability to care for her other children. The Santos family had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador when Maria was 5 years old, seeking better opportunities for their children in a country where education and hard work could lead to a better life. Maria had been their success story. The child who had adapted most easily to American culture while maintaining respect for her family's traditions. Disappearance had shattered their American dream and left them questioning whether they had made a mistake in leaving their homeland. David Park had been 7 years old when he'd vanished on June 2, 2001, while playing in his family's front yard.
His mother had stepped inside to answer the phone, and when she returned 5 minutes later, David was gone. The small red baseball cap found among Harold's trophies had been David's most prized possession. A gift from his uncle who played minor league baseball in Hartford and had signed the bill with a personal message that made the cap irreplaceable to a boy who dreamed of becoming a professional athlete. The Park family had lived on Elm Street just 2 blocks from Harold Richardson's house, which meant that David had probably encountered Harold numerous times during his short life. Harold had been known throughout the neighborhood as someone who enjoyed talking with children about their interests and activities, and David's mother recalled that the elderly man had often complimented David on his baseball skills when he'd seen the boy playing catch in the front yard. The search for David had involved not only local law enforcement, also state police and FBI agents, who had been called in because of concerns that he might have been abducted. The investigation had revealed that several residents had seen a man talking with children in the neighborhood during the weeks preceding David's disappearance. But the descriptions had been too vague to identify a specific suspect, and the investigation had eventually stalled when no physical evidence was discovered. Jennifer Walsh had been 11 years old when she'd disappeared on August 14, 2007, while riding her bicycle to the public library. She'd been participating in the summer reading program and had planned to check out books for a report she was writing about endangered animals. Her purple hair scrunchie, found preserved in Harold's trunk, had been part of a set her best friend had given her for her birthday, and she'd been wearing it when witnesses last saw her pedaling down Maple Street, just 3 blocks from where Harold Richardson lived. The investigation into Jennifer's disappearance had been the most extensive in Millfield's history because it had occurred during a period when law enforcement agencies were becoming more sophisticated in their approach to missing children cases. The Connecticut State Police had been called in immediately and had deployed resources, including helicopters and specially trained search dogs. But despite the intensive effort, no trace of Jennifer or her bicycle had ever been found. Jennifer's parents had been active in community organizations and had used their connections to generate widespread media attention for their daughter's case. They had appeared on television programs and had maintained a website dedicated to finding Jennifer that had attracted volunteers from across Connecticut and neighboring states. But despite the extensive publicity and thousands of tips from the public, no credible leads had ever emerged that could explain what had happened to their daughter. Michael Torres had been 6 years old when he'd vanished on November 3, 2019, the most recent victim in Harold's decades-long pattern of predation. Michael had been playing in his backyard when his mother went inside to start dinner. When she called for him 20 minutes later, he was nowhere to be found. The small dinosaur toy found in Harold's collection had been Michael's constant companion since his 3rd birthday, and parents had included detailed photographs of it in their missing person report, hoping someone would recognize the distinctive purple triceratops. The search for Michael had benefited from modern technology, including cell phone alerts that had been sent to thousands of residents within a 50-mile radius, and social media campaigns that had spread information about his disappearance across multiple platforms within hours of his parents reporting him missing. But despite the rapid response and extensive use of modern communication tools, no trace of Michael had been found, and his case had joined the growing list of unsolved missing children cases that haunted Connecticut law enforcement. The forensic examination of Harold's house revealed the sophisticated planning that had enabled him to commit these crimes without detection for nearly 3 decades. His basement workshop contained restraints that had been bolted to the concrete walls, soundproofing materials that would have prevented screams from being heard by neighbors, and cleaning supplies that had been used to eliminate forensic evidence after each murder. The workshop's floor showed traces of bleach and other chemical that had been applied so thoroughly that investigators found it difficult to recover usable DNA evidence. Despite the advanced techniques available to modern forensic science, the investigation revealed that Harold had maintained detailed records of his crimes hidden in a false wall behind his basement furnace. The records included photographs documenting each stage of his interactions with the victims, timeline charts showing how he'd planned and executed each abduction, and psychological profiles where he'd analyzed each child's personality and family situation to determine how to approach them without raising suspicion. The level of premeditation revealed by these documents transformed the investigation from a case involving a disturbed individual acting on impulse to evidence of calculated predatory behavior spanning nearly 3 decades. The community's reaction to Harold Richardson's exposure as a serial killer of children created trauma that extended far beyond the families of his victims.
Parents throughout Millfield were forced to confront the reality that they had trusted their children's safety to someone who had been using that trust to identify and select. Victims' neighbors who had considered Harold a friend struggled to reconcile their memories of his kindness and generosity with the evidence of his monstrous crimes. The 6 families whose decades-long nightmares finally ended with the discovery of Harold's trunk experienced a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. Patricia Mitchell, Sarah's mother, had spent 41 years wondering what had happened to her daughter, alternating between hope that Sarah might still be alive somewhere and despair that she would never know the truth. Harold's death had denied her the opportunity to confront her daughter's killer directly, but it had also provided the answers she'd been seeking since that September afternoon in 1982. Sandra Chen, Timothy's mother, had remarried and moved to California in 2001. Unable to continue living in Millfield, where every street corner reminded her of a missing son, when Detective Rodriguez called to inform her that Timothy's remains had been found, and his killer identified, Sandra's first reaction was disbelief, followed by a grief that felt as fresh as it had 28 years earlier. She flew back to Connecticut for the first time in over 2 decades to reclaim her son's remains. Carmen Santos, Maria's mother, had never stopped believing that her daughter would return home someday, maintaining Maria's bedroom exactly as it had been on the day she disappeared in 1998, when Detective Rodriguez visited Carmen at her home on Pine Street to deliver the news that Maria's remains had been identified. Carmen collapsed in her kitchen, clutching the silver cross necklace that had been returned to her as evidence of Harold's crimes. The Park family had relocated to Florida shortly after David's disappearance in 2001, unable to cope with constant reminders of their missing son in the neighborhood where he had vanished. When they learned that David's killer had been identified and his remains recovered, they felt a mixture of relief and anger that Harold had been allowed to die peacefully without facing justice for his crimes. Jennifer Walsh's parents had divorced in 2010, 3 years after their daughter's disappearance, unable to maintain their relationship under the stress of not knowing what had happened to their child. The revelation that Harold Richardson had killed their daughter provided closure. Been seeking for 16 years, but it could not repair the damage that his crimes had inflicted on their family. Michael Torres's parents were the most recent victims of Harold's crimes, and their grief was still raw when his remains were identified in 2023. The discovery that their son's killer had been a respected member of their community who had attended Michael's funeral and offered condolences to their family created an additional layer of betrayal and trauma.
O czym pan mówi? Sekretarz stanu USA w końcu się odezwał. Mówię o Europejskim Sojuszu Obronnym. Nawroki uśmiechnął się. Francja, Niemcy, Polska, kraje skandynawskie, może Turcja. Bez amerykańskiej dominacji, bez amerykańskich żądań, bez amerykańskich rachunków. Czy Nawroki blefował? Czy rzeczywiście istniały plany alternatywnego Sojuszu Europejskiego? I dlaczego prezydent Francji skinął głową, gdy usłyszał o Europejskim Sojuszu Obronnym? To niemożliwe. Trump potrząsnął głową. Europa nie ma własnego arsenału nuklearnego. Francja ma 300 głowic nuklearnych. Przerwał mu Nawroki. Wielka Brytania ma 2 tecze. To wystarczy, żeby powstrzymać każdego agresora. Ale nie macie systemów obrony przeciwrakietowej. Próbował argumentować Trump. Kupujemy od Izraela. Iron Dome kosztuje 1/3 część ceny Patriot. Nawroki miał odpowiadać na wszystko, a Izraelczycy nie żądają, żebyśmy walczyli w ich wojnach. Nie macie samolotów. Francuzi sprzedają Rafale za połowę ceny. Szwedzi mają Gripen za ćwierć ceny. Nawroki wyliczał alternatywy, a żaden z tych krajów nie każe nam płacić za własne bazy na naszym terytorium. Trump był coraz bardziej zdenerwowany. Po raz pierwszy w życiu spotkał się z kimś, kto miał gotowe alternatywy dla amerykańskiej oferty. Panie prezydencie, Nawroki spojrzał na zegarek. Minęła godzina od pańskiego ultimatum. Teraz słucha pan mojego. 48 godzin na wycofanie żądań. Albo Polska idzie swoją drogą. A co z Rosją? Trump grał ostatnią kartę. Bez Ameryki Rosja was zniszczy. Nawroki się roześmiał. Panie prezydencie, Rosja ma problem z Ukrainą. Krajem 5 razy mniejszym od Polski. A pan myśli, że zaatakuje członka US armią silniejszą niż ukraińska. Poza tym, dodał Nawroki, jak już mówiłem, Francja ma bomby atomowe. A Francuzi, w przeciwieństwie do Amerykanów, nie będą się wahać, czy użyć ich w obronie Europy. Czy Nawroki miał rację? Czy Francja rzeczywiście była gotowa użyć swojej broni nuklearnej w obronie Polski? A może to była tylko dyplomatyczna gra? Nie możecie tego zrobić. Trump był coraz bardziej desperate. Kongres was niszczy ekonomicznie. Sance. Nawroki wzruszył ramionami. Panie prezydencie, 60% polskiej gospodarki to handel z USA. 15% z USA. Kto więcej straci na wojnie handlowej? Poza tym, Nawroki wyjął ostatni dokument. Chiny już złożyły Polsce ofertę zastąpienia wszystkich amerykańskich kontraktów za 70% w cennej i bez politycznych warunków. Trump pobledł. Nie będziecie współpracować z komunistami. Nawroki się rozśmiał. Panie prezydencie, Chiny to kapitaliści. A w kapitalizmie liczy się tylko zysk. I chińska oferta jest po prostu lepsza. To jest koniec. Szepnął sekretarz obrony USA do Trumpa. Straciliśmy ich. Ale Trump jeszcze nie poddał. Dobrze, powiedział przez zaciśnięte zęby. Wycofujemy żądania. Ale pod warunkiem, nie ma warunków, przerwał mu Nawroki bezwarunkowe wycofanie żądań. Publiczne przeprosiny za próbę szantażu i gwarancja, że nigdy więcej nie będziecie próbować dyktować warunków sojusznikom. To jest upokorzenie. Trump wstał ze swojego miejsca. To jest sprawiedliwość, odpowiedział Nawroki pierwszy raz od 25. Prezydent Francji zaczął klaskać. Po nim prezydent Niemiec, potem premier Wielkiej Brytanii. W ciągu minuty cała sala oprócz amerykańskiej delegacji klaskała polskiemu prezydentowi. Trump stał w centrum uwagi, ale nie był jej bohaterem. Po raz pierwszy w karierze był pośmiewiskiem, a Nawroki stał się bohaterem nie tylko Polski, ale całej Europy. To jest koniec amerykańskiej hegemonii, szepnął jeden z francuskich dyplomatów do drugiego. I miał rację. W ciągu godzin po wystąpieniu Nawrokiego w Mar-a-Lago światowe media eksplodowały. Koniec ery Trumpa w NATO, pisała Financial Times. Polska pokazuje drogę do niezależności, analizował Washington Post. Nowa Europa przeciwko starej Ameryce, komentowała BBC. Ale najważniejsze były reakcje w samych krajach. Po raz pierwszy od lat europejscy politycy zaczęli mówić głosem niezależnym od Waszyngtonu. W Paryżu Macron ogłosił nowe otwarcie w europejskiej polityce obronnej. W Berlinie Scholz zapowiedział rewizję kosztów amerykańskich. W Londynie premier zasugerował brytyjsko-europejską współpracę obronną. Nawet w Rzymie i Madrycie politycy zaczęli mówić o europejskiej alternatywie dla amerykańskiej dominacji. W Waszyngtonie zapanowała panika. Doradcy Trumpa nie wiedzieli, jak reagować na pierwszą poważną porażkę swojego szefa na arenie międzynarodowej. To katastrofa, mówili republikańscy senatorzy podczas narad kryzysowych. Trump wyglądał jak amator, ale prawdziwy wstrząs nastąpił, gdy inne kraje zaczęły naśladować polską taktykę. W Seulu Korea Południowa ogłosiła rewizję kosztów amerykańskich baz. W Tokio Japonia zaproponowała azjatycki sojusz obronny. Nawet w Australii pojawiły się głosy o pacyficznej alternatywie dla amerykańskiej dominacji. Trump próbował odzyskać inicjatywę, organizując konferencję prasową w Białym Domu. Ale pytania dziennikarzy były bezlitosne. Dlaczego nie odpowiedział pan na polskie argumenty? Czy Ameryka rzeczywiście wykorzystuje strachy sojuszników dla zysku? Czy planuje pan przeprosić Polskę za ultimatum?
The town of Millfield struggled to rebuild its sense of community safety after Harold's crimes were exposed. Many families moved away, unable to continue living in a place where their children had been systematically stalked and murdered by someone they had trusted. The house at 47 remained empty for months before finally being purchased by developers who demolished it and built a small park dedicated to the memory of Harold's 6 victims. The Harold Richardson case raised disturbing questions that extended far beyond Millfield, Connecticut. How many other communities across America were harboring similar predators, hiding behind facades of respectability and community service? Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that Harold's methodology was sophisticated enough to evade detection for 3 decades, which suggested that other equally cunning predators might be operating undetected in small towns where trust and familiarity created perfect hunting grounds for those who understood how to exploit community bonds. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit used Harold's case as a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies across New England, highlighting the warning signs that communities and parents should watch for when evaluating adults who seek access to children. Harold's pattern of gradually building relationships with families over months or years before striking represented a level of patience and calculation that traditional stranger danger education programs had never addressed. Parents were taught to fear unknown threats. But Harold's crimes demonstrated that the greatest danger might come from the most trusted members of their own communities. The psychological profile that emerged from Harold's case challenged many assumptions about how serial killers operate. Harold had not been a social outcast or obviously disturbed individual. Instead, he had been the epitome of respectability, using his teaching background and community involvement to create an unassailable public image that deflected suspicion even when children in his vicinity were disappearing. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining normal relationships with neighbors and colleagues represented a level of psychological sophistication that made detection nearly impossible through conventional means. Detective Rodriguez often wondered how many other cases she had worked over the years might have involved similar predators who had successfully evaded suspicion by cultivating reputations as pillars of their communities. The Harold Richardson investigation had taught her to look beyond obvious suspects and consider whether community figures might be hiding dark secrets behind their public personas. The case had fundamentally changed how she approached missing children investigations, particularly in small communities where everyone believed they knew everyone else. The cleaning crew who had discovered Harold's trunk were forever changed by their role in exposing his crimes. Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, and Jake Williams had initially felt proud of their contribution to solving decades-old mysteries and providing closure to grieving families. But as the full scope of Harold's crimes became clear, they began to struggle with nightmares and anxiety about what other horrors might be hidden in seemingly innocent homes. They claimed the discovery had shattered their ability to approach their work with the same emotional detachment that had previously protected them from the trauma they encountered in the profession. Robert Richardson, Harold's nephew, faced his own psychological challenges as he struggled to reconcile his memories of his uncle with the evidence of his crimes. Robert had genuinely loved Harold and had considered him a positive role model during his own difficult childhood. Revelation that his beloved uncle had been a serial killer of children created an identity crisis that required years of therapy to resolve. Robert had to confront the possibility that his own childhood interactions with Harold might have been inappropriate, though he had no specific memories of abuse. The media attention surrounding Harold's case had attracted interest from criminal psychologists and forensic experts who wanted to study how such an extensive pattern of predation could remain undetected for so long. Several universities requested access to Harold's journals and records for academic research purposes, hoping to identify behavioral markers that might help law enforcement agencies recognize similar predators before they could claim victims. The case had become a landmark study in criminal psychology, demonstrating how intelligence, education, and community respect serve as camouflage for the most heinous crimes. If you've been following cases like this where predators hide in plain sight, remember that evil doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. Sometimes it wears the face of the kindest person in your neighborhood. The teacher who stays after school to help struggling students, or the elderly man who never forgets to water your plants when you're away. The Harold Richardson case reminds us that we must remain vigilant even in the places and with the people we trust most, because sometimes the greatest monsters are those who've learned to disguise themselves as angels. If you've been following cases like this where predators hide in plain sight, remember that evil doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. Sometimes it wears the face of the kindest person in your neighborhood. The teacher who stays after school to help struggling students, or the elderly man who never forgets to water your plants when you're away. The Harold Richardson case reminds us that we must remain vigilant even in the places and with the people we trust most, because sometimes the greatest monsters are those who've learned to disguise themselves as angels.